Hi, good morning. Thanks for that nice introduction. It's great to be here this morning, and it's so fantastic to see this full room. I'd like to, in addition to what you just heard, I'd just like to kind of preface my presentation by letting you know that for 3 years I was on the board for the Waterkeeper Alliance and have recently joined the board for the National Wildlife Federation. And as you just heard, I am a special advisor to the Alliance for Climate Protection, which is Al Gore's nonprofit. So the issue of the environment has been something that I've been involved with for a long time, and when I do get involved with an issue, it's something that I stick with and I'm committed to, and I persevere until changes happen that I think should happen. So I'd like to kind of take you on a little journey with me from West Virginia to Louisiana for this oil spill, and then finish it off by going to Alberta. I'm from Canada originally, but I've lived in the United States for about 20 years now, and frankly became a United States citizen just over a year ago, which I'm very proud to have done. So I've got the best of both worlds, but I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about the fossil fuel industry and how the industries are having a huge impact on our environment, on our communities, on our health as individuals, on our air and on our water. So if we could have the first slide, please. Last fall, I went to West Virginia. There's a practice called mountaintop removal coal mining that I'm sure many of you have heard about. What they do is, what the coal industry does in West Virginia and in other states in this country is they literally blast off the mountaintops. They then take that debris and dump it into surrounding hollows or into surrounding waterways. To date, there are approximately 2,000 miles of rivers and streams that have been completely buried from mountaintop removal coal mining. And in addition, there are approximately 470 mountaintops in the Appalachian Mountain Range alone that look like this. This is a picture I took the first time that I saw mountaintop removal coal mining. We went up hiking alongside a mountain ridge. And you know, as is often the case when you're hiking, you're kind of looking down, seeing where you're going. And when we reached the crest, when we reached the ridge, and I looked up, this is what I saw. What used to be a mountain was flattened, and it was just sand and dust and gravel and rock. That piece of that kind of pylon right in the foreground stands about 6 to 7 feet high. So I think that it's tough to kind of get the perspective, but I hope that it does give you a little bit of perspective of the site of this particular mine. Next slide, please. Very, taken from a similar spot, but it kind of gives you a little bit of a farther range view of what it was that was happening that day. One of the things that I found rather eerie about seeing this firsthand, after having read about it and seen my own pictures of it, was how quiet it was, how there were no natural sounds, there were no birds, there was no nature. It was as if everything was frozen. Next slide, please. We got up in a plane and did a flyover, which is, just as it sounds. And we ran across this particular mountaintop removal site. Now, if you can see towards the bottom right of the slide, you see these kind of orange markings. Those are trucks, those are leveler trucks. And those vehicles stand about 3 stories high. So that can give you a definite perspective as to the scale of this particular mountain range and how it was completely devastated. Now, part of what they're supposed to do in mountaintop removal is reclaim the mountain. In other words, restore it back to its original glory, which is, as you can imagine, impossible to do. Just for one very basic fact of it takes 1,000 years for 1 inch of the topsoil in the Appalachian Mountain Range to get the nutrients that it has. 1,000 years. It's impossible to reclaim these mountains. Next slide, please. This is another mountaintop removal site that I saw. These pictures were taken from my iPhone. So I wish that I had a really fantastic camera to be able to show you even more detail of what we saw. But again, I think that this gives you an idea as to what's happening, what the coal industry does in West Virginia with mountaintop removal coal mining. Next slide. Now, what they do after they get the coal from these seams is they wash the coal before they put it on trains and send it to where it needs to go. Now, after they wash the coal, this slurry, it has the texture of a slurry. They just dump this slurry into these ponds, or actually they call them lagoons. Now, there are high levels of carcinogens in these slurry lagoons: arsenic, selenium, mercury, lead. This particular lagoon has about 2 billion gallons of this slurry. In this, again, right in this whole mountain range. And this is an unlined lagoon. So these carcinogens seep into the groundwater. And the surrounding communities have been living with not just air that is completely polluted, but waterways that are polluted with these carcinogens, causing clearly early death rates, cancer rates. There are chronic heart, lung, kidney diseases rampant in these communities. Next slide, please. And this is another slurry pond that we flew over on that particular day. It's astonishing how, in this particular state alone, this kind of destruction to the environment, to the air, to the waterways, to the individuals, how this continues on a daily basis, and how pretty much for the most part the general public is not aware of what's happening in this country, how we are garnering coal. Coal provides 50% of our electricity. People are not aware of these kinds of facts. But part of the work that I'm doing in collaboration with the organizations that I'm involved with is to bring this awareness to the American people so that we can move in a direction to start weaning ourselves off of these fossil fuels. Now, I went to Louisiana a few weeks ago for the oil spill. If I could have the next slide, please. And I was there with the National Wildlife Federation. These pictures were taken from, again, from not a very good camera source, but these are photos that I did take. We've all been inundated over the last few weeks with incredibly disturbing images of oil-slicked birds and wildlife, of marshlands that are being inundated with oil coming up on the beaches all across the Gulf. I have to tell you that this one day we were out with a number of boats. We were about 15 miles south of Venice, Louisiana, and about 35 miles west of where the Horizon rig exploded and sank. And when we came across this area and we drifted into this, literally it was like a sea of oil. You can see the back of the boat there in the corner of the slide, and I hope that you can get some kind of sense as to the darkness and the water there. Next slide, please. There are other photos that I think hopefully will show a little bit more detail of what it was like to be there. It was, if I could have the next slide, please. When you sift through, or when you float through this kind of, it was more than a sheen. It was like the consistency of warm molasses in a way. It was untreated. The dispersants hadn't been sprayed over this particular area. Next slide, please. Everywhere we looked, from where these boats were, we saw that. For as far as the eye could see. There were no skimmers around. There were no, it was just us. It was boats. And again, the eeriest thing about it was that it was silent. Next slide, please. There were no fish jumping. There were no birds swirling around. The wake of the boat was brown. Do you know? We had to turn off the engines and just drift through this because it was literally burning out the engines. The oil was kind of, from the water, the motors on the boat were being destroyed from it. I remember, can I have the next slide, please? The smell of it, the first thing that hit me was the smell. You could almost smell it from a distance as we were coming across this. And then finally we shut down the boats. There were about 4 or 5 boats that we had, some of them with scientists and filmmakers and news crews, etc. You can see this gentleman trying to immerse an underwater camera. It didn't work, even though we wanted to get footage from at least a good 100 to 200 feet down. the oil was so thick that it just completely covered the lens. So try as they might, each time they tried to submerge it, it was a futile effort. But you can see the line of the oil on the hull of this boat. Next slide, please. The thing that it reminded me of when I saw it was the line of the water line of the homes and the businesses in New Orleans from Hurricane Katrina, how some of those buildings still stand that are permanently stained from that devastation. And here in that same area, we were seeing the same thing again. You could taste it in the back of your throat. That was the thing too. It was literally this toxic and I couldn't get rid of it for a good couple of days. We had to put on these respirators finally to try to breathe clearly. But you can see there's nothing around there. There were no skimmers. BP had not been, as we all know, they were not set up to even handle any of this right from the get-go, even though legally they were supposed to. Next slide. And we all have been finding out exactly what was going on again. Next slide, please. This is the same kind of experience the same kind of feelings that I experienced when I saw what I saw in West Virginia. Was this kind of, at first you feel, it's overwhelming because you feel distraught and very saddened by what you see. And yet, at the same time, it just enraged me. When you see these things firsthand, and you meet the people that are living in these communities, and you see the devastation on their faces about what their lives are going to be like, what's going to happen when the camera crews leave, what's going to happen a few years from now, what's going to happen in the next generation when these families are not being able to sustain their lifestyles and their livelihoods and their traditions. The only positive thing that can happen from these devastating events, not even events, but from this disaster, is that finally we are taking a look at how these industries run their businesses, how they skirt around regulations and have done so for many years without any regard for how their actions are impacting individuals, families, communities, the environment, air that we breathe, water that we drink. That's the only good thing, is that we're finally taking notice. And if there's any representative, any senator that is hesitant at all to pass comprehensive climate legislation, I want them to visit both of these sites, and then we can talk about how they can be apprehensive about moving this country in the direction that it needs to move in. May I have the next slide, please? Now, a lot of the oil industry is lobbying very diligently now, particularly since this BP crisis, to get oil from, domestic oil, so that we can have better national security, and so that we're not spending, right now we're borrowing $1 billion a day to buy oil from countries primarily that we're at war with. So what they're looking at is to create a new pipeline from Alberta, from the Alberta tar sands, to go right from Alberta to Houston, Texas. There have already been 2 pipelines that have been built within the last few years. There's another pipeline that they want to build that would pump in high pressure levels of the dirtiest fossil fuel on the planet, and that's called the Alberta tar sands. Now, the largest reserve of tar sands are in Alberta. And what they're underneath the boreal forest, this pristine forest, which is the habitat for 50% of migratory birds in North America, and many, high populations of wolves and grizzly bears. Underneath this forest lies the sand that's filled with oil. So they blast gas-powered steam into these. First of all, they annihilate the forest clearly. They just clear-cut the whole area. They blast steam into this sand so that to force the oil to come to the surface. Now, for every barrel of oil that is produced this way, it takes 3 barrels of water. What they do with that water after they've completely contaminated it is they dump it into what they call tailings ponds. Now, it's interesting that in Alberta, and again, I'm from Canada, I take this personally. Interesting that they call it ponds, and in West Virginia they call it lagoons, when neither one of these things, these are toxic wastelands is what they are. Here's one of the sites in Alberta. You can see these mines, by the way, from space. They are so massive that you can see them from outer space. Those trucks that were in the photo from West Virginia, I have not been to Alberta yet. These photos were taken from by a man named Amon McMahon. These are the same height of trucks that were in West Virginia, about at least 3 stories high. This is the kind of devastation that's happening in Alberta. Next slide, please. That far pond, that's one of the tailings ponds. Again, filled, unlined, contaminated with carcinogens that seep into waterways. There's an indigenous community a couple of hundred miles downstream where the community has 1,200 people as residents. 100 of them have died from cancer recently. Next slide. Here's a pipe of that contaminated water just being spewed into this open site. Next slide, please. May I have the next slide, unless that's the last slide, I'm not sure. Anyway, you get the gist of what's going on. And on this note of the Alberta tar sands, there's a site the size of the state of Florida that is now set for extraction. So here we are, April 5th, there was a coal mine disaster that killed 29 people in West Virginia. 2 weeks later, the Horizon rig exploded and sank. This is what's going on. You saw what's going on in Alberta. The fossil fuel industry is one that is wreaking havoc all across the board. Now, these images and the truth about what's going on may seem overwhelming, and indeed, it can feel that way. Believe me, I get that kind of feeling. Yet here's what can happen. Here are the solutions that we need to make sure do happen. First of all, President Obama said just a few weeks ago in his address to the nation, quote, "The time to embrace a clean energy future is now. Now is the moment." So his first address from the Oval Office, and that is exactly what he said. So we need to do everything that we can do to make sure that he follows through on those words. And on that note, that means we need to pass comprehensive climate legislation so that we can charge for fossil fuels spewing greenhouse gases into the air, and we can move this country into the direction where we can create 2 million jobs, where we can create sustainable, clean energy to purify our air and our waterways again. We need to learn the facts about what is going on with these industries. They spend at least $300 million a year on advertising. For each elected official in this city, they have 4 lobbyists. So they are spending big money and big time to try to continue what they have been doing for far too long. So we have the resources to educate ourselves and to educate everybody in our social media networks, everybody that we come in contact with, let them know the truth about what's going on. We need to be more energy efficient. Almost everybody I know is learning how to do that more in their homes, in their communities, in every single possible, in their workspaces, in their churches, every single arena that we live our lives in. We must be leaders and encourage energy efficiency. And on top of that, in addition to all of those things, and maybe even most importantly, we need to get involved with the political process on this issue. I don't know what else it could possibly take. How many more lives need to be lost? How many more environmental disasters need to happen in such short succession? The coal mine disaster, Horizon rig, the tanker filled with oil and coal leaving Australia, heading for China, that ran aground the Great Barrier Reef, another coal mine disaster that killed 2 people in Kentucky a few weeks ago. It's one thing after another. Now is the time that we need to do something about it. We have to get involved in the political process. And I have to say, one of the great things about this country, one of the reasons why I wanted to become a citizen after living here for so long, is knowing that we have the capacity and we have been able to mobilize and come together on issues that we care about as a nation. Happened with the civil rights movement. It's happening now with immigration. It needs to happen on this issue. And I have to say that I expect that there be a grassroots, ground level revolution so that we can pass this legislation so that, enough is enough. Enough is enough. So learn what you can. Tell everybody you know what's going on. Be leaders in your own communities on this issue and get involved in the political process. Thank you so much for being here today.